Hey there, and welcome to my strategy guide for Xhul'Horac on normal or heroic difficulty as relevant to healers. You can use the guide below to skip to specific abilities and phases if you wish. Xhul'Horac switches between Fel and Void spells throughout the encounter, and a basic summation is to not let the two spell types ever cross each other. You can see which spell skill he's using by his color, green for Fel, purple for Void. Being affected by any spell leaves a debuff called Fel Touched or Void Touched on players that will explode doing massive damage within 20 yards if the player is affected by a spell of the opposite school. For example, if a player with Void Touched runs into green fire, massive damage is dealt to anyone in 20 yards and the fire is destroyed. In Phase 1, from 100% health to 65% health, Xhul'Horac uses Fel Magic, occasionally casting Fel Strike on your tank, which does moderate single target damage. This phase is not healing intensive. Every 30 seconds or so, Xhul'Horac places a debuff called Fel Surge on a few random players, dealing light ticking fire damage. At the end of the duration, a patch of green fire will spawn under these players' feet. Place these at the edge of the room, and keep it as contained to this half of the room as possible throughout the fight. Xhul'Horac also summons a large ad at 90% health called Vanguard Achilleon that shares health with Xhul'Horac and should be focused down. This ad casts chains of Fel on 3 random players, linking them together. To break the chains, simply move away from each other. The damage from this is almost unnoticeable. Wild Pyromaniacs, or small imps, will spawn from the green portal and cast Fel Orb, which travels toward a random player and deals damage when it connects with any player. This is fairly negligible damage. Intercepting this will leave a dot on you and spawn green fire on the ground. But throughout the entire fight, no imp should be allowed to cast any spells, so this shouldn't be an issue. They should be killed as soon as possible, stunned and interrupted until they die. Phase 2 begins when the large ad dies at around 65% health. Your entire raid should now immediately move to the opposite side of the room, taking care that all Fel Imps are already dead before you do so. This phase tends to be more healing intensive, but still fairly non-stressful. Xhul'Horac will now cast Void spells, occasionally casting Void Strike on your tank. Instead of Fel Surge, he will now cast Void Surge, which spawns purple fire at the end of its duration instead. If you end up struggling for room, there's a nice trick for clearing more room that I recommend your raid utilizes. Someone with a strong defensive cooldown like a hunter can purposely expose themselves to Void Touched, run into green fire, and destroy it. If this is being done, take care not to be within 20 yards of this person. Whatever you do, don't run into green fire if you're targeted with Void Surge or already have the debuff Void Touched. Xhul'Horac will prefer to cast this on players who do not already have the Fel Touched debuff. Instead of spawning Fel Imps, he will now spawn unstable Void Fiends near players. These target the nearest player and cast Volatile Void Step. This teleports them to the nearest player, and if anyone is standing in the purple swirl below them when this cast finishes, Void Fire will spawn. This should never happen. They continue to target to the nearest player and teleport to them, repeatedly until they die. Any ranged, including healers, can effectively control where these move by standing close to the circle swirl, but not in it each time. You need to do this to make sure it does not move into the melee, since they might not move in time and risk spawning fire. And also, so it doesn't move vast distances, allowing the ranged to focus them uninterrupted if your raid decides to kill them. Potentially, your raid might decide to just leave them alive if your raid leader decides that your raid is good enough to not ever stand underneath them. This phase also has its own large ad called Omnis, which shares health with the boss as before. Omnis spawns black holes that deal raid-wide damage the entire time they exist and drag everyone in the raid towards them. Whenever any player moves into the singularity at the center of this black hole, it will collapse and deal split damage to anyone in this black hole. I prefer to have everyone near the black hole soak it together. A player with an immunity can soak it alone, but they need to make sure they use their immunity before entering the black hole at all. If they use their immunity once they're already inside, they will die regardless. This may be a bug, it may be intended, but either way I prefer to avoid soaking with immunities unless the black hole is in Africa. Be careful not to enter the center of it too quickly and kill yourself before enough players are soaking with you. Phase 3 begins when Omnis dies at around 35% health. This phase is much more healing intensive. Xhul'Horac will now switch between Fel and Void spells at will. You need to make sure that if you get Fel Surge or Void Surge that you place it on the correct side of the room away from the opposite type of fire. Make sure to keep control of the Void Fiends, keeping them out of green fire, and don't let the Imps cast any spells. This is also a good time to clear some fire if possible. Xhul'Horac will be casting both Fel Strike and Void Strike on your tank. Since these leave Fel Touch and Void Touch on your tanks, they will be tank swapping to avoid blowing up the raid. Cooldowns may be needed if any explosions happen here. At 20% health, no more adds will spawn since he closes both portals. No surprise, this is the most healing intensive phase of the fight. He begins to do bursts of raid-wide damage every 10 seconds, which increase in damage by 10% each time. This acts as a soften rage mechanic that makes the last phase a race characterized by how quickly you can kill the boss and how long your raid can stay alive. You should save and use every cooldown available to you and your raid in this phase. So, that brings this guide to an end. Good luck in the encounter, and feel free to give the video a thumbs up if you found it useful, comment if you have any questions or suggestions, and subscribe for more.